850 feet above Manhattan, a steel beam carried 11 men and nothing else. No harness, no net, no rope tied to anything. Third from the left sat an ironworker named Joseph Eckner, a cigarette burning down between 2 fingers, his boots hanging in open air over 49th Street. Nobody on that beam was working. That is the part almost everyone gets wrong. It was the 20th of September, 1932. The men had been sent up there, arranged in a row, handed lunch pails, and photographed. Somewhere below them, a public relations department was waiting on the prints. The original caption that went out with the picture was flat and commercial. It read, "Builders of the city enjoy luncheon." It was an advertisement. For office space, nobody wanted to rent. And here is the detail that reframes the whole photograph. 6 days after those men sat down on that beam, the steel frame of the building underneath them was finished, topped out, done. By the time the picture reached American newspapers, the thing it appeared to document had already stopped happening. So if the most famous construction photograph ever taken was staged and taken at the very end of the job, then where is the actual machine story? What lifted 58,500 tons of steel into the sky above a city that had run out of money? We spent weeks pulling this one together, and the answer turned out to be underneath a different building on the same block. A machine. So far ahead of 1932 that the United States Navy classified the technology and kept it locked down until the end of the Second World War. Stay with us. We are going to walk this site from the bedrock up, the hole, the steel, the hydraulics, the photograph, the men on the beam, and the number that nobody in this story can actually give you. To understand why this project existed at all, you have to start with a promise that broke. In the late 1920s, the Metropolitan Opera wanted a new house. The company had outgrown its old building, and it wanted something worthy of the city. The plan that came together was ambitious, even by Manhattan standards. A grand opera house set inside a square of commercial towers. The whole thing built on 3 blocks of Midtown, leased from Columbia University. John D. Rockefeller Jr. signed on as the man who would put up the land and carry the lease. On paper, it worked. The opera would anchor the development, the commercial buildings would carry the rent, and the whole square would pay for itself. Then the market collapsed. On the 6th of December, 1929, the opera withdrew. The plans for the opera house were abandoned. The anchor tenant, the entire reason the development existed, simply walked away and left the land where it was. What Rockefeller was holding at that point was not an idea anymore. It was a contract. The lease from Columbia University ran for 87 years. The initial annual rent was $3 million. To put that figure in scale, it was roughly 10 times the revenue generated by the 229 buildings already standing on that ground. Those buildings were paying their way. The lease was not. Every single day, the site sat idle. The combined losses from rent and taxes ran at $7.61 per minute. Work that out across a full day and a full year, and you understand the pressure he was under. There was no version of this where he waited for the economy to recover. He had 2 real options: walk away from the lease and absorb one of the largest private losses in American commercial history, or put something on that ground that could earn. He built. We should say plainly what this channel does with a story like that, because it shapes everything that follows. We work from the primary record, and where the record runs out, we say so on camera instead of filling the hole. Subscribing costs you nothing, and it is the only signal that tells us this is worth the research time. In 1931, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company agreed to buy bonds on the project up to $65 million at 5% annual interest. Rockefeller took on full personal liability for it. Not a corporation shielding him. Not a syndicate spreading the exposure. Him, personally, against $65 million of debt in the third year of the Great Depression. Construction started on the 22nd of July, 1931. The early cost estimates covering land, demolition, and the first buildings came to roughly $250 million, which makes this the largest privately financed construction project of its era. Rent guarantees from the radio and film companies that would become the tenants brought in $3 million a year, which is the number that made the arithmetic survivable. Then came the clearing, and this is where the machines finally enter the story. 228 buildings came down. The developers described the removal as 1.25 million tons of building material. Brownstones, speakeasies, tenements, storefronts, rooming houses. 3 city blocks of 19th century New York scraped flat while people stood at the fences and watched. Underneath all of it sat Manhattan schist. That is the hard metamorphic rock that runs under this island, and it is the only reason towers can stand here at all. Excavation began in April of 1931, and the photographs held by the Library of Congress show exactly what did the work. Steam shovels and trucks. That is the honest technical record for this phase, and it is worth pausing on how ordinary it is. No tunnel boring machines, no hydraulic breakers. No machine on that site would look modern to anyone working today. Steam shovels biting into rock, and a queue of trucks hauling it east to be dumped. Men with hand drills working the seams the shovels could not reach. We can give you a hard excavation figure for one part of the site. For the ground under the British Empire Building and La Maison Française, crews moved more than 28,000 cubic yards of material in under 2 months. For the tower itself, the RCA Building, that specific number does not survive in any source we were able to open. We are going to be straight with you about that every time it happens in this film, because a great deal of what circulates about this building was borrowed from a different job site 12 blocks south, and we will get to exactly how that happened. The steel erection contract went to a firm called Post McCord. Hold on to that name, because it is going to come back in this story for an uncomfortable reason. Post McCord were the steel erectors for the Rockefeller Center units, and their speed on this job was remarkable, even by the standards of a decade that was obsessed with speed. On the British Empire Building, the frame topped out 16 working days after erection began. 16 days from first column to last beam. The RCA Building, the 70-story tower now known as 30 Rockefeller Plaza, was a different order of problem. Its superstructure carries 58,500 short tons of steel. Depending on which measuring system you count in, that is 52,200 long tons, or 53,100 metric tons. However you convert it, it is a mass of steel roughly equivalent to a fleet of destroyers, stood on end in the middle of a working city, on a plot bounded by streets that never closed to traffic for a single day of the job. Work on that frame began in March of 1932. By the 16th of September, the steel stood at the 64th floor. 10 days after that, on the 26th of September, 1932, the crews raised an American flag over the 66-story tower and topped it out. Now read those 2 dates against the photograph one more time, because the sequence matters. The men sat down on that beam on the 20th. The building topped out on the 26th. That picture was taken in the final week of the steel job, when the frame was within a handful of floors of complete. While the frame climbed, the skin followed it up. From July of 1932, crews were setting Indiana limestone at a rate of 2,000 cubic feet per day. That stone was cut and finished at 4 separate plants across New York State, and shipped in on a schedule tight enough that the facade never fell far behind the steel. 2,000 cubic feet a day is a delivery rhythm, not a construction rate. It means quarry, mill, railcar, truck, and hoist all had to hold the same tempo for months, in an economy where suppliers were going under every week. One plant failing would have stalled the entire skin. Inside, Westinghouse installed 8 express elevators in the RCA Building alone. The finished tower carries 60 elevators in total and roughly 6,000 windows, framed with aluminum spandrels that were a genuinely modern choice for the period. Now we have to stop because there is something here that most videos about this building will not tell you. If you go looking online for the machines that raised this steel, you will find very specific figures. Guy derricks with 75-foot booms and 82-foot masts, lifting capacities of 20 and 30 tons. 38 riveting gangs working 4 men to a crew. A heater who fired the rivets, a catcher who took them in a bucket, a bucker-up who held them, and a gunman who drove them home. Every one of those numbers is real. They were published in Engineering News Record, and every one of them describes the Empire State Building, not this one. The confusion is easy to understand once you see the cause, because Post and McCord erected both towers. Same contractor, same city, same 3-year window, same trade press covering both jobs. So the specifications drift across from one project to the other, get repeated by the next writer, and eventually sound settled. We are not going to hand you the Empire State Building's derricks and tell you they lifted this tower. For the RCA Building specifically, the derrick models, the gang count, the total rivets driven, and the tonnage of rock removed are not documented in any source we were able to open. Neither is the mill that rolled the steel or the fabricator who cut it, at least not separately from the other job. That is the honest limit of the surviving record, and we would rather show you where it stops than borrow a number from a building we have already covered on this channel. Because the real machine story on this site was never in the tower anyway. Cross the plaza to the northwest corner of the site and go down. Radio City Music Hall broke ground in December of 1931 and topped out in August of 1932. 9 months from first excavation to finished frame. Into it went 15,000 miles of copper wire and 200 miles of brass pipe. It opened to the public on the 27th of December, 1932, 4 days after Christmas, in a year when a quarter of the American workforce had no job at all. The engineering landmark here sits underneath the stage, and almost nobody in that audience has ever seen it. The hall above it seats close to 6,000 people, and every one of them walks in over the machine without knowing the machine is there. The system was designed and built in 1932 by a firm called Peter Clark, Incorporated. The patent application went in that March, and there is exactly one name on the document. Here is what that machine does. The stage is not one surface. It is 3 separate platform stages, each one 70 feet wide and between 12 and 16 feet deep, and each one rides on its own hydraulic elevator. They travel from 27 feet below stage level to 13 feet above it. That is a total vertical range of 40 feet, moving at 1 foot per second, carrying performers and scenery, while an audience watches. When the 3 platforms lock level with each other, they form a single turntable 43 feet across that can rotate a complete set in view of the house. The power behind that is a water hydraulic system running at 400 pound per square inch, fed from a 20,000-gallon pressure tank buried below the building. The rams are arranged in an 8-piston configuration. If you are still with us at this point, you are the reason this channel covers the machinery instead of the postcards. Subscribe, and we will keep going this deep. The lifting capacity is the figure that stops you. The system can raise and lower 190 tons of stage. On top of that mass, it can haul an additional 96,000 pounds of load. Sit with what that means for 1932. This is heavy industrial hydraulic machinery, precision-controlled to the inch, installed inside a theater, and asked to run twice a day in front of paying customers without one visible failure. Out on the construction sites of this country, most contractors were still running cable and friction drums on their crawler tractors. Hydraulics on ordinary earth-moving equipment were more than a decade away from being standard. A bulldozer operator in 1932 was pulling a blade with wire rope and hoping the cable held. And under a variety theater on 6th Avenue, an 8-piston hydraulic system was lifting 190 tons on cue. Then the war came. When the United States Navy needed elevator systems for aircraft carriers, they needed something very specific: machinery that could raise enormous weight quickly, stop it dead in an exact position, and do it on a deck that was itself moving in 3 axes on open ocean. That is not a problem you solve from a blank sheet of paper in wartime. They took the Radio City design. The stage machinery under this theater was placed under wartime restriction. Public access to those mechanisms was shut off, and it stayed shut off until the end of the Second World War. For years, tourists walked across a floor that was carrying a military secret, and the ushers who worked the aisles above it were not told what was underneath them. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers has since designated the Radio City stage a historic mechanical engineering landmark. Not the tower, not the plaza, not the skating rink or the tree or any of the things that end up on the postcards. The hydraulics. So when somebody asks what machine built Rockefeller Center, this is the answer that survives with its paperwork intact and its patent on file. 8 pistons, 400 pounds per square inch, 20,000 gallons, 190 tons of moving floor, and a straight line from a Depression-era stage in Midtown Manhattan to the flight decks of the Pacific. Now back to the beam. The 20th of September, 1932. 69th floor of the RCA Building. 11 ironworkers, 1 steel girder, and 850 feet of open air underneath them. We should flag a disagreement in the sources right here, because you will see 3 different heights quoted for this photograph, and all 3 appear in serious places. 850 feet is the roof height of the finished building. The original Bettman archive caption says over 800 feet. Other accounts say 840. We are giving you all 3 rather than splitting the difference, because none of them is wrong, so much as measured from a different reference point. The picture was distributed by a wire service called Acme News Pictures. It began appearing in American newspapers on the 30th of September, and it ran in the Sunday supplement of the New York Herald Tribune on the 2nd of October, 1932, under the headline that would stay attached to it for the next 90 years. This was an arranged shot, and nobody involved has ever seriously claimed otherwise. The Rockefeller Center archivist and the agency that later owned the negative both describe it as a public relations effort. Plain and simple. The complex needed tenants. Empty office towers in the middle of a depression do not lease themselves, and this one had 14 buildings coming out of the ground with a $65 million bond behind them. So the publicity department put men on a girder and made the danger itself the sales pitch. They shot more than 1 frame that day. From the same session, there are photographs of the men lying asleep on the beam, throwing a football across it, holding an American flag, and riding a suspended block of stone. That whole sequence tells you what it was. It was a photo shoot with a props list, which brings us to the question we could not answer, and neither can anyone else. Who took it? For decades, the picture was credited to Louis Hine, which is wrong and has been known to be wrong for a long time. In 2003, after the daughter of a photographer named Charles Ebbets brought forward a case for her father, the agency formally attributed the image to him. His 1932 payroll record survives, and it shows him hired as photographic director for the complex at $1.50 per hour. Then further evidence surfaced showing that two other photographers, Thomas Kelly and William Leftwich, were also working that site on that day. The attribution was withdrawn. So as of today, the most reproduced construction photograph in the world is officially credited to nobody at all. 3 men were up there with cameras, and the record cannot separate them. The physical object itself has had a rough life. The original glass negative broke into 5 pieces at some point in its history. What remains of it now sits in climate-controlled storage inside a converted limestone mine in Pennsylvania, a facility built to outlast almost anything. The Bettman Archive was bought in 1995. In 2016, the image division changed hands again, this time to an arm of a Chinese media group, and Getty Images licenses the picture worldwide. Follow that chain all the way through, and you get something genuinely strange. A photograph of 11 American ironworkers, taken by a photographer nobody can name, broken into 5 pieces, stored in a hole in the ground in Pennsylvania, and licensed out of Beijing. That chain took us the better part of a week to trace properly, and it is the sort of thing that gets flattened into one sentence everywhere else. If you want the long version rather than the flattened one, subscribing keeps us making it. So who is actually on the beam? The honest answer is 2 of them. 2 men out of 11 have been verified. That was done by cross-referencing them against other photographs taken on the same day in which they were named, and confirmed with the Rockefeller Center archivist, Joseph Eckner, is 3rd from the left. Joe Curtis is 3rd from the right. That is the whole list of certainty. 9 faces remain open, and they have stayed open for 90 years despite an enormous amount of effort spent trying to close them. The man on the far right, the one holding a bottle, is widely identified as a Slovak ironworker named Gustav Popovic. That identification rests on a note he wrote on the back of a print and sent home to his wife Mariska. The line he wrote was, "Don't you worry, my dear Mariska." A man on a girder 800 feet up, writing home to tell his wife not to be frightened by the picture she was about to see. Beyond those, every name attached to this photograph is a family claim, and there are a lot of them. In 2012, an Irish documentary called Men at Lunch went looking for the rest. The trigger was a handwritten note pinned up in a pub in Shanaglis, County Galway, which read, "Picture of my dad and my uncle, far left and right, Sonny Glynn and Matty O'Shaughnessy." The film was directed by Sean O'Quallen, narrated by Fionnuala Flanagan, and premiered at the Galway Film Flead on the 13th of July, 2012. There is also a Mohawk claim on the photograph. A man identified as Peter Rice is said to be 6th from the left, presented as the great-grandfather of 2 living descendants, and that identification has been displayed in a museum exhibition. What we could not find is a contemporary 1932 source confirming it. We should handle the broader Mohawk question carefully, because it gets stretched in both directions, and both distortions do a disservice. The involvement of Mohawk ironworkers from Kanawake in New York High Steel is real, and it is documented. A Cornell historian has stated flatly that virtually every skyscraper in this city, Rockefeller Center, and the Empire State, and the Chrysler among them, was built with Mohawk and other Iroquois ironworkers on the crews. That is not folklore. What is not established is any specific headcount for this particular project, and the figures you sometimes see quoted, like 90% of the workforce, have no project-level source underneath them. There is one thing worth quoting directly, because it corrects a myth that the men themselves disliked being handed. An ironworker named Kyle Karonhiaktati Bove put it this way: "A lot of people think Mohawks aren't afraid of heights. That's not true. We have as much fear as the next guy. The difference is that we deal with it better." What makes this so hard to settle is the nature of the evidence. There is no crew list attached to the photograph. Payroll records from a 1932 construction site were not kept as a historical archive. They were kept for accounting, and most of them are gone. Faces in a wire service print, reproduced and re-reproduced for decades, degrade. And a grandson holding a family photograph and a genuine memory is not lying. He is simply working from the same thin evidence as everyone else. 11 men, 5 competing nationalities claimed across the row, 2 names that hold up under checking. Now we come to the part of this story where we are going to disappoint you on purpose. If you have watched anything else about this photograph, you have probably heard a statistic. It goes like this, and we are quoting it exactly as it circulates. 2 out of every 5 construction workers fell to their deaths or were disabled while building New York's skyscrapers in the 1920s. 2 out of 5. 40%. We went looking for the origin of that number. We could not find one. It appears in secondary write-ups, and it gets repeated from there, and no primary source sits underneath it. No coroner's record, no union ledger, no contemporary study, no insurance table. Under our own sourcing rule, a figure with no floor under it does not go into a script, so we are telling you where it came from, and then setting it down. Here is what the record does support, from the buildings we can actually count. The Empire State Building. 5 workers died over the 13 months of construction from 1929 to 1930. Measured against a workforce of 3,400, that is a rate of 1.47 deaths per 1,000 workers. The Chrysler Building. 3,000 workers, 0 deaths across the entire job. The World Trade Center, decades later, and with far better equipment, remains the deadliest construction project in the history of this city, with 60 fatalities. Now hold those figures against the 40% claim, and you can see the size of the distortion. 40% of the Empire State workforce would have meant more than 1,300 dead men on one job site in 13 months. A city that argued about a broken elevator in the newspapers would have talked about nothing else for a generation. So what is the real death toll for Rockefeller Center? We do not know, and as far as we can establish, neither does anybody else. Across every source we opened, there is no verified fatality figure for this complex. Not a total, not a per-building breakdown, not a range with a source attached to it. Nothing. That absence is not a small thing, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. 40,000 or more workers passed through this site. Some estimates of the total workforce run as high as 250,000, depending on how you count men who came for a season and left. 3 city blocks, 14 buildings, 4 years of steel and stone driven through the deepest economic collapse this country has ever experienced. And the number of men who did not come home from it is simply not written down anywhere we can reach. The safety context around that gap is not in dispute. The federal agency that regulates workplace safety in this country did not exist until 1971, which is 39 years after this photograph was taken. The specific standard covering steel erection is roughly 20 years old. For the men on that beam, there was no requirement to tie off, no requirement to hang a net, and no requirement to file anything if one of them went over. A safety director for the Ironworkers International Union described the conditions in this photograph in a single sentence. They worked in conditions that didn't have safety requirements. That's what that picture symbolizes. No harness, no net, no rule demanding either one, and no ledger. Whether anyone fell from that beam, on that day, or on any other day of the job, we cannot tell you. No source we opened records a death on the 20th of September, 1932. That is not the same statement as saying nobody died. It means the paperwork does not exist. And the difference between those two things is the difference between history and guessing. If you would rather have that answer than a confident, invented one, subscribing is how you keep this channel making them. There is one more machine in this story, and it was a hand tool. While the steel was going up outside, the RCA Building lobby was being finished inside. The Rockefeller family commissioned a mural for the main wall from the Mexican painter Diego Rivera, one of the most celebrated artists working anywhere in the world at that moment. The agreed fee was $21,000. The work was titled Man at the Crossroads, and it measured roughly 4.85 meters by 11.45 meters. A wall-sized statement in the entrance hall of the most expensive private building project in America. On the 28th of April, 1933, Rivera added a figure that had not appeared in the approved sketches. Vladimir Lenin, painted into the composition, joining the hands of a soldier and a worker. He was asked to remove it. He refused, and offered instead to balance it by adding an American figure on the opposite side. That offer was turned down. On the 10th of May, 1933, the New York Times ran the headline across its pages: Rockefellers ban Lenin in RCA mural and dismiss Rivera. A contemporary account described the moment the envelope reached him on the scaffold. It held a check for $14,000, the final payment against the $21,000 he was owed. It also held a letter telling him he was fired. The wall was covered within the hour. There is only one visual record of the unfinished work anywhere, and it exists because an assistant named Lucienne Bloch smuggled a camera onto the site and photographed the fresco against the rules she had been given. Without her, we would have nothing but descriptions. In February of 1934, the fresco was chipped off the wall and destroyed. It was removed in pieces, by hand, with the plaster taken back to the substrate so that nothing of the image remained. In its place went a mural by the Catalan painter Josep Maria Sert, and that replacement is still hanging in the lobby today, seen by thousands of people a day who have no idea what is underneath it. Rivera kept the full $21,000. So on this one site, inside about 18 months, a hydraulic stage was installed that the Navy would classify. A photograph was staged that would outlive every man in it, and a finished wall was demolished with hand tools because of a single face painted on it. Stand in the plaza today, and almost none of this is visible. The steel is inside the walls. The excavation is under the pavement. The 11 men are unnamed except for 2. The photographer is unknown. The mural is gone, chipped off and carted away before most of the tenants ever moved in. What survives with its documentation intact is the machine that nobody photographed. The hydraulic stage is still under Radio City Music Hall, still moving, still lifting 190 tons on cue, and it is the only element of this entire complex that carries a historic mechanical engineering landmark designation. There is one last coda, and it is a strange one. The observation deck on top of the RC, a building, now runs an attraction where visitors can sit on a beam and have their picture taken. Roughly 90 years after a publicity department sent 11 ironworkers up a tower to help lease empty office space, the same photograph is being sold again. This time to tourists, one seat at a time, on a beam that is bolted down. The original negative is still in 5 pieces in a mine in Pennsylvania. The men on it are still mostly nameless. And the machine that has the best claim to have actually built this place is still running, twice a day, under a stage where nobody looks. If you want the rest of this era, we have already walked the Empire State Building derrick by derrick, and the Chrysler Building spire that went up through its own roof in 90 minutes. Both are linked below. And tell us this in the comments, because we genuinely want to know, and no archive can answer it. If you worked high steel, or your father or your grandfather did, what is the one thing about that trade that outsiders always get wrong? not the danger. The part nobody ever thinks to ask about. We read every one of them.